Psychotherapy Networker senior writer. Thanks for being with us today. When you get a sec, go ahead and drop a note in your messages and let us know where you are joining from. And that'll be the place where you make a comment or ask a question as we go along. We would love to hear from you. And quickly, before we get started, if you're not already a subscriber to our National Magazine Award-winning publication, your attendance here today entitles you to a deep discount. So you can go to the subscription page at any time for psychonetworker.org for more information. I am so pleased to be here with the one and only Carol Gilligan. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Lauren.
So just so we all know who we're dealing with, Time Magazine has called Carol one of our most influential Americans. And in fact, for most of us who took Intro to Psych or Gender Studies or Women's Psychology classes, Carol's definitely had an impact. The work that she chronicles in her very famous book, In a Different Voice, which has been called the little book that started a revolution, it changed the way our profession thinks about psychology and about the morality of women. Since that book, Carol's written and co-authored a number of others, including Why Does Patriarchy Exist? Such a great question. And Darkness Now Visible, Patriarchy's Resurgence and Feminist Resistance. At Harvard for more than 3 decades, she is now university professor at NYU. So we are going to talk with Carol today about what might be happening to women's voices in light of recent cultural and political pressures, including the pending Supreme Court decision about abortion rights. And what therapists can do to help clients who are concerned about those rights and worried about whether their voices still matter and are still being heard. So to get a little context, Carol, let's start at the beginning. Central to In a Different Voice was your study of women's moral reasoning, which, and not everybody remembers this, you undertook with young women considering an abortion. So let's go back in time to what the field thought of women and their voices and their morality when you undertook your study.
I mean, actually, Lauren, the answer is the field didn't think of women. I mean, that's what was stunning. And I did not in any sense set out to study women, which is what made the discovery really a discovery. Because if you notice, my book is called In a Different Voice. And it really is, it's not about women, it's about a voice. And it was the discovery that the field had a voice. Meaning, what's a voice? It's a way of speaking about psychology, about morality, about human life, about relationships. And in the early 1970s, I became interested in really basically a very basic psychotherapy question, which is, how do people think about choices in their lives? I mean, when you come to a place and the roads diverge and you have to decide which way am I going to go? And I was interested in who is the I in that question? Who's the I in the question, what am I going to do? And does moral language come in? When people, I mean, the question, what should I do? Or what is the right thing to do? Mm-hmm. So I thought, I'm not interested in what people might say in the abstract. I'm interested when you have to live with it. And it was the early 1970s, and people don't remember now, there was a Vietnam War going on and there was a draft, and I was teaching at Harvard. And I was teaching Harvard students who were going to face the Vietnam draft. So I thought, I'll interview them when they're seniors in college and facing the draft and ask them, what are they going to do? Are they going to enlist in the army, or are they going to go to Canada or to jail? Mm-hmm. Then in 1973, President Nixon ends the draft. So that was the end of my study, except what else happens in 73? Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court legalizes abortion. So I think, here's another place where people come to a public place. They have to make a decision in a finite period of time. I will study people who are pregnant and thinking about whether to have an abortion or continue the pregnancy. And for that reason, I end up listening to women. And I make the discovery which you have to realize is astonishing to me at the time, which is really ironic because look at me, I'm a woman. I have been teaching the work of Freud. I'm teaching at Harvard, adolescent psychology, developmental psychology. I'm teaching the work of Erik Erikson. I'm teaching the work of Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg. I taught with Erikson, with Kohlberg. And I make the discovery that all of these men in writing about human development, human psychology, are listening to boys and men. And then, like Freud writes, the sexual life of men alone is accessible to our research. And Erikson says, women don't follow his 8 stages. The sequence is different for women. Women confuse intimacy with identity. And you think, well, this is not a small subgroup. I mean, this is half the population.
Yeah.
And Kohlberg says women basically don't get to the 6th stage of my 6 stages of moral reasoning. Freud says women have less sense of justice. So here I am in the 70s listening to women. Psychologists building theories had not listened to women. And I said, wait a minute, I'm listening to women, specifically listening to women talking about whether to end pregnancy or continue it. And I'm hearing a voice that differs from the voice of psychological theory. And I write a book called In a Different Voice.
Yep. Can you share, because we've talked, and you told me this earlier, people rarely talk to you about the actual study, right?
Well, what's so interesting is, let's be real. You Google In a Different Voice. First of all, the abortion decision, it was that study that led me to write In a Different Voice. Because I heard a way of speaking that started, and it wasn't like all women, but I heard a way of speaking that started from a premise of connectedness rather than separateness. And that connected reason thinking with feelings.
Yeah.
And you see, women had always been dismissed as too emotional and too involved in relationship, also praised for being emotional and being devoted to relationships. So in other words, it was like I was listening to women and I heard a different way of speaking about self, that is of being connected rather than separate, and also a different way of speaking about morality, which is that started from a premise of that we live, that our lives are interdependent. And of course, the pregnancy was almost like a manifestation of that, because the whole dilemma arose out of the fact of connection.
Well, let's dig down to that a little bit, if you don't mind. Tell us a story or two maybe about the forces that were shaping their decisions when they talked to you.
Let me tell you exactly. I'm at this very, you can see kind of where I was at this time. What stood out for me initially was a tendency for women and I must say, just so we're clear about this, I interviewed women with Mary Belenke, who later went on to write Women's Ways of Knowing with her colleagues, but she was a student at Harvard and she was my friend and neighbor. So we interviewed women from street front clinics in Boston South End, from university counseling services, from pregnancy, from preterm, from what's it called, Planned Parenthood. All of Black women, white women, poor women, well-off women, teenagers, across the board. What stood out for me was the tendency for a woman to label whatever she wanted to do as selfish. In other words, if she wanted to have the baby and people wanted her to have the abortion, it was selfish. If she wanted to have the abortion and other people wanted her to have the baby, that was selfish. Whereas doing what other people wanted her to do or thought she should do was good and moral. And that's what really, because I had never, so this idea that the moral world was sort of, it was like, here were these pillars. And on one hand was the word selfish, which meant bad or hurtful. And the other was selfless, which meant good. So to be a good woman was to be as if one had no voice of one's own. And, we're talking about therapy now. We're talking to therapists.
Yeah.
As a lot of women discovered, that's a recipe for disaster. Because what happened was, and I'll give you, first of all, an example. So there's this woman, I remember her name, let's call her Nina. She's in her 20s. Maybe it's her boyfriend, maybe it's her husband, I don't remember. He's a law student, and he wants her to have an abortion because he wants to finish law school and she's supporting him. So she tells me she's having an abortion because he wants her to end the pregnancy. I say to her, I understand that, but what do you want to do? And she says to me, as though I'm sort of like, who am I? She says, what's wrong with doing something for someone you love? And I say, nothing. But what do you want to do? I mean, she looks at me as though, how could I even ask that question?
Mm-hmm.
Well, now think about it, play it out. What happens? So she has the abortion, and then she blames him.
Mm.
And then she realizes, actually, this is after the Supreme Court decision, she could have done what she wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, this decision that was made for the sake of the relationship ends up sabotaging the relationship. So I start asking women, this is 1973, if it's good to be empathic and responsive to people's needs and concerns, you're a person. Why is it selfish to respond to yourself?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And woman after woman, Lauren, at that moment said to me, good question. And that was, I realized we were living in a world where that depended for its continuation on women's silence.
Right.
On women basically acting as if they had no voice of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And to just bring it up to the moment, because this is so important, if you think about the leaked Alito, opinion, draft opinion, that's what the court is about to enact. To say to women, you have no voice in this decision. No voice.
Do we know in your work, did you discover what the impact is of not having that voice? When you were doing the work, they had the voice. It was sort of a new opportunity.
No, I think it was a struggle.
It was a struggle.
It went and I think it's still a struggle. I still hear women in my seminars, I mean, incredible women, law students, graduate students, PhD students, and I have a thing where I say research starts with a question. What is your question? What is your real question? And I'll hear from women, this is selfish, but what I really want to know is, as opposed to what's a good question or an important question.
Right.
And I think that we have not, or maybe we have, but we need to, that for a woman to bring her own voice in to the conversation is to disrupt a patriarchal structure, which depends on, for its continuation, on men's violence or the threat of men's violence and on women's silence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the sense of how disruptive women's voices are within structures that depend on women speaking for everyone except for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll tell you another thing. I sat when I was in England, this was, a while ago, and I was invited to sit in on family therapy sessions at the Tavistock Institute. And a lot of them were doing what I think was called Milan family therapy, where everyone in the family says what everybody else in the family is thinking. They would go around. And I was very interested in sitting in where there was an 11-year-old girl in the family, because I'm very interested in that pre-adolescent girl's voice. So they go around, and the 11-year-old would say what the mother was feeling. And the mother would start to cry because no one had said what she was feeling, including her.
She never had that voice, yeah.
She did, well, I think I would say it differently. She had learned that to be a good woman, she had to act as if she had no voice, because everyone has a voice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're born with a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody silences themselves or, quote, loses their voice. No one loses their voice. And people don't silence themselves for no reason.
Right.
And the mother, to be a good mother, was supposed to speak for everybody in the family and act as though she had no voice. But what I learned from my study, which I wasn't setting out to learn, was this move, which was ostensibly for the sake of the relationship, really, in fact, sabotaged the relationship because the woman wasn't present.
Yeah.
She wasn't in relationship.
Yeah.
And I think we have to ask how many structures we have in our society right now that depend on basically women not being present, or if present, acting as if we have no voice of our own.
Right, right. I'm thinking about this from a therapist perspective, being in the therapy room or on a Zoom call. And you have this conundrum, right? Part of being a practicing therapist is not wanting to influence a client who's making a decision about something that has a moral component, right? About something like abortion, or about something that's
not imposing your view on them. Sure, absolutely.
So some therapists might say altogether, hey, this is not my arena. But do you see them having a role here, a way of kind of having a conversation?
Well, it seems to me that I mean, I think the abortion in this conversation right now is a red herring. And because I think the issue for a therapist is if a woman in therapy is speaking or acting or living as if she has no voice, as if she doesn't know what she's feeling, as if she doesn't know what she's thinking, as if she could tell you about everybody else, but she doesn't know what she wants. That's a huge challenge for a therapist. I think the question is, what happened to her voice? I mean, I don't think it's a question of whether the therapist is for abortion or against abortions. It's just that for a woman to act as if she has no voice is a woman not to be present. She's not present in the therapy. She's not present in her relationships. And I think, again, I mean, I've come more and more to see the incentives that are offered to women for acting as if we don't have a voice of our own. I mean, look at what happened with the current administration. The bill that would have provided money for childcare, for healthcare, for things that fall disproportionately on women, doesn't get support. But highways and bridges and the military, there's plenty of money for that. And then you say, we're in a world where women have the vote. Mm-hmm. So where are women's voices? And I think that for therapists, if a woman is speaking as though, I mean, that has to be a major therapy question. As a researcher, I mean, if I'm interviewing a woman, it's interesting. What I've come to through my work, and particularly through my work with girls, is to see how at a certain point in development, a voice goes under, which I would call a kind of a human voice, and gets covered by a cover voice. And what I learned is you have to question the cover voice. Mm-hmm. You want to hear the voice that's underneath. Mm-hmm. So I think therapists know that. I mean, you do that all the time.
Right.
And where it got signaled to me, and this was initially by girls, was by the phrase really or actually. And I'll tell you a really interesting example because it comes from an unlikely place, which is the last diary entry of Anne Frank. So here's Anne Frank in an attic in the Netherlands, writing in her diary to her fictional friend Kitty. And halfway through this entry, she says, "If I were to be quite honest, I must admit." And you think, wait a minute, what's before that? And then she completely reframes what she had been talking about. So I started with girls to hear the word actually. A girl says to me, "I don't like myself enough to look out for myself." And I think, oh, another girl with low self-esteem, I could put her in that box. But I think actually that's very sad. So I say, do you really feel that way? She says to me, actually, this is how I look out for myself. I never say what I'm really feeling and thinking. In that way, no matter what anybody says to me, I don't care because they have no idea who I am. And then she looks at me and she says, brilliant, isn't it? And I say, yes, but it's at the expense of what you said you wanted, which is on relationships. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think this phrase, which I think a lot of us as girls particularly, it's like, do you see me? Do you know me? Would you like to know what I really think? That the sense of that is how often we're the incentives if we don't say what we really think, if we don't say how we learn what people want us to say, or
Right.
want us to feel and think. That's like the core of psychotherapy. So I'm not talking about a therapist's political stance. I'm talking about, I don't see how you do therapy with women if you're not invested in a woman's relationship with her own voice.
Mm-hmm. Over the years, have you found that hesitation is still there, even after Roe v. Wade, even after other sort of progressive?
Well, what I see right now is the society is as represented by Alito and those who are, hell bent on getting rid of Roe v. Wade are determined to silence women again, and to say, that in a sense, to make the cost of speaking out for women prohibitively high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's because women started speaking out. Look, I wrote about girls as resistors, and then I suddenly see they're in the Congress now. Look at AOC.
Mm-hmm.
They object to her dancing, and she dances in front of her office. And she's just not going to be silenced by them. And it's because women have been speaking out more and making a difference that you start to see that starts to unsettle certain structures that are contingent on basically women being, use the phrase, dissociated
Mm-hmm.
from themselves. And the prices, it's a paradox. And, the sense of, here, I'll give you a quote from my girls' research. This is a girl who was the valedictorian of her high school class, had been admitted to all the top colleges. She was, really a very attractive girl. And she said, if I were to say what I was feeling and thinking, no one would want to be with me. My voice would be too loud. So she's not saying, or another girl says, the voice that stands up for what I believe in has been buried deep inside me. Now, what's interesting is these girls are aware that they're not saying what they're feeling and thinking, but they're also aware that if they were to do that, their voice would be heard as too loud, use the word too angry,
Mm-hmm.
too much, too something.
Mm-hmm.
So there are huge incentives offered to girls and women for learning what people want them to say rather than, and I think that's the heart of therapy. So it seems to me it's in your office all the time, this issue.
Yeah. Yep. Do you have any concerns that with the Supreme Court decision, we will see this receding of voice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because, look at the price. You think about the Texas law. So let's imagine a girl who becomes pregnant through, let's just do the extreme, through rape or incest. And she's, first of all, she hasn't even kept track of her menstrual periods. And suddenly it's after 6 weeks. Now, if she even goes to somebody and asks for help and they respond, they're liable to at least a $10,000 fine. So you have built a wall of silence around her. She literally can't, she's, nobody can help her.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, she has no voice in this decision because she was raped, because she's a person who's a victim of incest. She has to have the baby. There's a thing in the New York Times now, some teenager who had twins because she couldn't have an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's saying we're comfortable, a proportion of this society is comfortable by saying women have no voice. Rather than engaging with the voice of a woman, doesn't mean, that doesn't mean anything a woman says is right or anything she says is, but it's like what you do in therapy. You invite somebody's voice into your presence and you engage with it. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's what's going on right now. There's a move to silence women in the name of morality. So it's very ironic.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So in that idea of morality, women's morality, in a way, is kind of, they're asking it to sort of return to those early conversations that you had with them about having the concern of the other people first. It's all about, right.
Having only the concerns of other people. Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, and you know what happened at that moment? I mean, that was a historic moment because when the highest court in the land says to women, you have a legitimate voice in a decision which has real ramifications involving issues of life and death and many people and so forth and so on. And what women started to some of the women who were in my study, where they began to question. And they said, instead of selflessness, being as if you have no voice or needs of your own, being the epitome of feminine morality, that it was irresponsible, that it was a moral problem because it was an abdication of voice and an evasion of responsibility in relationships. So instead of selflessness being the height of morality, in fact, it was morally problematic. And what women needed to do is to be present, to take responsibility for the choices they made, because they were going to live with the consequences. I mean, it's just the psychological logic of this. I mean, I love doing this with you and Psychotherapy Networker because it's a completely it's not a political conversation we're having, it's a psychological conversation. About the cost for women of having to act as if they have no voice of their own. Right. And I think you always have to say, because everybody has a voice. I mean, even before language, babies can express how they're feeling. And we know now from all the research how responsive and how, interactive even very young babies are. So if people talk about someone losing their voice, the question is, what happened?
Yeah.
I think we know the answer is trauma of some sort. So there,
Carol, I mean, your voice has been present for all these years on these issues. Do you see other people within the field, both academic psychologists and practicing psychologists, echoing some of what you're saying? Do you feel like there's involvement? Do you feel like there are places therapists can go if they want?
Hugely. I'm not the only one by any means. I mean, one of my former students, Niobe Way, who's now my colleague at NYU, her book about boys, Deep Secrets about boys' voices, was just, cited as was loosely the source for a film that just won a prize at Cannes. I mean, I think this work is out there very much, and I think in fact, it's in response to this that you're getting the elite of this. I mean, you have to say, with all that's going on in our world right now, we really have to think about what's happening with the climate and so forth, inequality. Why this focus on abortion and birth control and so forth? And I think it's because you have to think that there is there's an order of living, it's called patriarchy, that is contingent on women's silence. And what's happened is women were starting to speak. And look at Greta Thunberg, one girl. I mean, she had more influence in terms of climate change. The largest climate demonstration in history was this one 16-year-old in her climate strike. She wins a Nobel Prize, and she's the person of the year. The policeman who killed George Floyd, the evidence, one girl, Darnella Frazier, holds up her phone and films the murder. And the interesting question is not that she did it, but what happened to everybody else? And these girls say it was wrong. So I think what you're talking about is women's voices really making a difference now, people paying attention, and it's threatening something. And so you get this pushback. And I mean, I think where you started with is, and there's a move to silence therapists, to say if therapists encourage women to have a voice that's political. No, it's not political. It's psychological. It's like therapists know the consequences of not having a voice.
Go ahead.
Let's say, to go back to the 70s, the time I was first writing, there's a chapter in Jean Baker Miller's book called Doing Good and Feeling Bad. It was about depression in women. Yeah. And it was about women doing all of this to help other people and feeling bad because they basically had no voice of their own.
I think about your original question for women about why don't they, what about their own voice? Their own voice really mattering, and the women explaining to you that, you know, it's important for them to sort of take everybody's perspective into account, everybody's voice into account. And I remember having it. I remember my college art in college with a different voice. I can still see the typeface on the cover, a sort of sharp, whatever that was, the
white on the red,
the
yeah.
white, holding the, you know, we're having this discussion, and it was, well, but women's morality is so important. It's important for peaceful families. It's important to show that your own point of view shouldn't be the only point of view. It's warmer. It's more inclusive. It's more welcoming. And this idea, I think, that there's something really beautiful about women taking the whole into account rather than themselves into account. Do you ever have that pushback on this?
Well, I mean, I think what you just said is so interesting, because I think what you said is beautiful. That to be aware of what other people are thinking and feeling, that's key to maintaining whether it's harmony in a family or a world that we can all live in.
Yeah.
I mean, and that women have been lauded for attending to how other people are feeling. I mean, everyone should do that. And, you know, so the question is not paying attention to what other people are feeling and thinking. That's just a good thing. And what's interesting is we start out as humans. It's not just women. This is a human thing. After I did the work with girls with my student Judy Chu, who then went on to write this book about boys called When Boys Become, quote, boys. And we were observing 4 and 5-year-old boys, and these little 4-year-old, 5-year-olds, one of them says to his mother, "Mommy, why do you smile when you're sad?" Now that's a 5-year-old boy. Or, "Mommy, I hear a happy voice, but I also hear a little worried voice." I mean, this attention to the human world around us is a human capacity. And the thing is, the deal that society makes for women is, we're going to praise you for doing that, but you can attend to everybody's voice except your own. And that makes no sense. And in fact, that doesn't maintain relationships. Because, I mean, as I said, I gave you the example. If a woman, say, has an abortion because her boyfriend wants to, or the priest tells her to, or her husband wants her to, who's responsible for that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really it doesn't help the relationship. I mean, the idea is not for her. There's not a zero-sum game between attending to other people and attending to yourself. It's not an either or.
Mm-hmm.
Is a real dilemma is when people's, needs are different. How do you work out? How are you going to deal with that? Well, that's what you would call a real dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
It comes up all the time. And the best thing is if you can deal with it in relationship and conversation. And you can only do that if everyone has a voice, because if you don't have equal voice, then it's the use of force. Whoever has more power wins.
Mm-hmm.
So democracy depends on equal voice. And love relationships depend on everyone having a voice, so you can solve these inevitable conflicts in relationship. And the idea that the solution is that the woman represents everybody's voice but not her own, or assumes if she does that other people will represent her voice, and then discovers that doesn't happen. It's devastating.
Mm-hmm.
I thought if I took care of you, you would take care of me. It's like, wait a minute. Why didn't you take care of yourself?
Right.
Well, that would be selfish. What's selfish about it? Isn't it good to take care of people? Well, yes. I mean, if I were a therapist, this would be the conversation I would be in with women.
Yeah. Are there other issues that you feel like involve women silencing their voices sort of beyond abortion that therapists need to be paying attention to?
It's across the board. I think it's just across the board. I mean, let me just say, with this horrendous thing we all lived through of this terrible school shooting, and I think, still largely women do the lion's share of childcare. And how do you send a child to school knowing that there are people running around with, what is it, AK-15 rifles who could come into I mean, I don't even know how you live through the day thinking your child is in this.
Yeah.
So why aren't all the women out in the street?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just, you know, and what about when they were separating children from families at the border? Where, I mean, I think that's what I think. If you have a structure that privileges the voices of fathers, the voices of powerful men, over the voices of other men and over women and over people of color, and then you go the whole thing. That depends on keeping basically with women who are a majority. It depends on separating women from their own voices. And what my research, I spent 10 years after In a Different Voice doing research on girls, with girls, to learn from girls about coming of age. With my graduate students, we published 5 books together. And what we learned is that what had been called development is better thought of as a process of initiation, where basically there's pressure on girls to separate their minds from their bodies, which means also their minds from their desires, their thoughts from their emotions, themselves from their relationships as the price of being included. And I think I've come to see how many incentives are offered women for doing that.
Right.
And this, jobs, relationships, money, I mean, you name it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We just got a note in from someone who's talking, and I think I hear about this a lot in the work that we do, that women are still under so much pressure as mothers and as career women. So you can think about the loss of voice there, where you have to be sort of the doting mother and the strong person at the job, and it's hard to slow down and claim yourself in those spaces.
Well, to say what you need to be able to do what you would like to do, which is to take good care of your children. And if and whatever work that, career or whatever you also want to do, and what kind of supports are necessary. And, this country is an outlier in terms of we have no paid, maternity. I mean, it's just, so I think you have to say again, women are a majority of the voting population.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happened? I mean, something has happened to make it possible for women to say we should have more funding for the military and more for bridges and highways. But when it comes to childcare, oh, I'm fine, I'll manage.
Mm.
Don't think about me. Let's take care of our boys who are fighting in Iraq, wherever they're. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, this is pervasive.
Yeah.
And when it starts to shift, I think this is what I want to emphasize, because I think it is starting to shift. And people are starting to speak out. The pushback is huge. And that's when you realize what's at stake.
Let's talk about that pushback, Carol, because I think some of the hesitation for therapists might be to advise someone to go out there and do something that could also, be really hard to read.
My co-author, Naomi Snyder, she was my student, and she's now a psychoanalyst. She's a psychotherapist. And we wrote the book together, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? And she keeps emphasizing that, if you encourage a woman to be outspoken, I mean, to take what she cares most about, the voice, let's take my 16-year-old girl, this very bright, incredible girl who says the voice that stands up for what I believe in has been buried deep inside me. Mm. So let's say she unearths this voice and goes out and promotes what she believes in. Let's say whatever it is she believes in. She's going to get pushback. So you can't just say, oh, fantastic, you found your voice. I mean, you have to be aware. Oh, there's this incredible book called We Are Not Born Submissive. It's written by a French philosopher she taught at Harvard and Yale. I think her name is Manon Garcia. And she said, well, women are not born submissive. We are not by nature submissive. And it's not that we lack moral agency, but that as women, we often make a kind of very shrewd, sort of calculated assessment of the price we pay for freedom. And we choose to be submissive because the price of freedom, the price of not being submissive, is so high. So I really think that's what you have to, that if you're in therapy and a woman is talking about, I'm tired of not saying what I really think, I'm tired of sitting in all these meetings, I'm tired of, giving into my mother, my husband, my blah, 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 and so forth. I'm going to really, and I think it's interesting to say, what do you think is going to happen when you do that?
Yeah. Prepare, right?
And then how can you deal with that? And
practice and prepare.
Yeah. For example, you shouldn't be alone.
Yeah.
Who can be with you?
Yeah.
There are a lot of things we can say, which is not to say that we're going to endorse, we think everybody should be demonstrating for climate change to stop, which I do think is a good idea, but that's what I think. But anyway, it's not, I think it's a confusion. You see, I think it's interesting, and it's kind of invaded the therapy world, that if a therapist has an opinion, she's being political. Yeah. I think the issue is, if a therapist is being a good therapist, then part of her kind of challenge is to help a woman get in touch with her own voice and know what she really feels and thinks. And to be curious about, is there a cover voice and what's underneath that? And,
right.
to sort of awaken a woman's curiosity about where is her voice.
I like that idea, Carol, of being sure that you're also seeing the cover voice and knowing the cover voice and challenging the cover voice.
Well, I would give you just a little, listen for these words. Listen for the word actually. Listen for the word really, what I really think, how I really feel. Listen for the phrase to be honest. If I were to, because I think people signal.
Yeah.
And I think if you don't pick up on that, then you don't hear what I would call the under voice, which is to me the human voice.
We have one of the people that's joining us, Lathabo, I just want to share this. She says, I always say, Carol, that you can't pour from an empty jug. It's important to speak up, say what you need in order for you to be okay. Own your voice, use it regardless of what the majority may say. Own your truth.
I think that's great. I totally agree. And I want to add, I want to say, and be smart and be careful and protect and be careful with yourself. In other words, before you speak up, ask yourself, what do you need if you're going to say what you think? And maybe what you need is someone with you. Or maybe in other words, because there are real consequences, and we know that. I mean, for one thing, let me just say, we know, for example, that a woman who's in an abusive relationship, the most dangerous moment is when she stands up and says, I've had it, this is an abusive relationship, I'm leaving. And that's when she's most in danger of getting killed. So you say, stand up and say what you really think. Well, you don't want to quite say that. You want to say, listen to yourself.
Yeah.
And I think therapy is a place for women to know, for women to know what they know. And we're psychologists, so we know that often we don't know what's driving our behavior.
Stephanie also just wrote in and said, or shared, that what we're dealing with now is a backlash from the Me Too movement implemented by powerful males. Do you think there's something to that what we're looking at now with the Supreme Court decision, that there is a discomfort as to how the society was sort of moving?
Well, I guess my response, Lauren, is, does this surprise anybody? I mean, what did we think? that we would say we're tired actually of taking care of everybody and acting as though we have no needs of our own and we don't need support in order to, and we finally stand up. I mean, and does it surprise us that there's a pushback? We loved it when you did all of this. I mean, we know women paid I mean, who does the lion's share of caretaking in the society? Women and people of color. What is it? I mean, they're underpaid, they're undervalued. I mean, we know these things, and somebody finally stands up and says it. But the idea that I think we like to think is that as though they're challenging a whole structure that has depended on women having basically acting as if we don't have needs or we have no voice or, saying what a wonderful thing it is that you work all day long and do this incredible work, and then you come home and single-handedly you take care of it, and there's no support for you. I mean, come on.
Yep.
We're way past that, really.
I like your advice for the therapist to prepare the client for the personal pushback, right? Yeah. Then you're right. In a cultural sense, we were maybe unprepared for this kind of pushback. Lisa is asking a question: how about backlash and pushback within academia? Is that a different space, or do you still see it happening there too?
I think in academia, I don't think academia is separate from the rest of the society. I don't think so. I told you in my classes, I hear women say, their real question is a quote selfish question. I hear the word selfish. I think that what is it? What's the Chronicle of Higher Education said women's salaries across the board in academia are less than men's at every level. I think it's very interesting how quickly. In fact, there are places in academia now where you can't say the word woman.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, I mean, there's, the idea that the good woman, cares about everyone except herself.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the hope that if she does that, someone will care for her.
That's the silent hope, right?
That's the silent hope. If I care for you, if I do everything for you, if I do everything. And we know how that story doesn't usually end well. I mean, I think that story lands people in therapists' office.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in a way, I think we're in a very, very different place now from where I began in the 70s. I mean, when nobody, there were books then written by women and men, major books, The Psychological World of the Teenager, a study of 175 boys, co-authored by a man and his wife, saying, I can write about the psychological world of the teenagers without ever listening to girls. Mm. So I think that what we hadn't seen is that women and girls' voices disrupt that story. And so we're at a point now where we're really kind of on a cusp of change, that there really is change. I mean, there are women in places where women were never in the past, and women are speaking up. I mean, look at it. I mean, I spoke about AOC, think about the Speaker of the House as a woman, and so forth. And it does make a difference. And so that's when you start to get the pushback of, let's reinstate in the name of morality, which is, it's insidious. If you want to be a good woman, you have to act as though you have no voice of your own. I'll speak for everybody else. So you have to look at how the women's issues go to the bottom. And I think we saw this played out with what's it was called, the Build Back Better bill. The infrastructure bill passed, highways, roads, military, we all know those are gendered male. And the Build Back Better bill was childcare and healthcare and free education, and there was no money for that. Why was there no money? Because it was assumed that women will do it for nothing. So you talk about women having voices, and there you are. I mean, it's a huge issue. And I think the pushback on Roe v. Wade, and I don't know that this is talked about, just as it's not talked about that that's the centerpiece of In a Different Voice, that study, that's at the core of what this fight about abortion is can women have a voice?
Can I ask if you find that there are good places, you've done this over the years, where you're invited, a therapist could also join, that are influential on political issues, that where people are eager to hear what you have to say, even on the local level, if they're making decisions that are affecting women?
You know, it seems to me, I mean, when I did the work with girls, I remember thinking, we organized several projects that were really fantastic. One was called Women Teaching Girls, Girls Teaching Women. And I remember thinking at the time that, it would be great for women to spend some time every year with 11, 12-year-old girls because they're so outspoken.
They still have their voice a bit, right?
They're still saying what they really think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a wonderful thing. It's you can read Toni Morrison, you can read Charlotte Bronte. The beginning of Jane Eyre, Jane is 10, and Charlotte, that her aunt says to her, she calls her a liar. Jane is 10 years old, and she says, if I were a liar, I would say I love you, and I don't. Now, that's, that's the voice that gets silenced, that gets covered with, oh, I love you, And so, I mean, the voice, it's not as though it isn't in our midst. Girls are in our midst. And it's not just girls. This is about a human voice, because what's clear, my students, I talked about Niobe Wade, Judy Chu, took this work into work with boys. Niobe worked with adolescent boys. Judy did her thesis on 4 and 5-year-old boys. So we're really talking about a human voice here. And I mean, my book is titled In a Different Voice. It's not called In a Woman's Voice.
Yeah.
You can say what is the different voice? What does it differ from? It differs from a patriarchal voice, which is bound to these gender binaries and hierarchies. And in a patriarchal structure, which is what the fight is about right now, certainly the Roe v. Wade fight is about, the human voice is a voice of resistance. Now, that's very, very hopeful.
Yeah.
And it says that the psychotherapists, in encouraging their patients to access their human voices, are in fact basically healing, educating, encouraging the resistance to very damaging structures. So that's basically, that's what we're talking about here.
It's interesting to look to the younger kids for hope and guidance on some of this.
Well, but they're saying they're in our midst.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just, you don't have to import this. It's right.
Yeah.
And you could say, if you want to maintain a structure where certain humans are said to be superior and other humans are said to be inferior, whether you do this on the basis of race or class or gender or sexuality or religion or whatever, you have to stunt or traumatize these human relational capacities.
Mm-hmm.
So then people get sick and they come into psychotherapy, or they become forlorn, they become depressed, they become anxious, and they come to psychotherapy, and the psychotherapist basically helps them to get in touch with their humanity, with their human voice.
Mm-hmm.
And then they take that out into the world and they realize there's a pushback.
Yeah.
So I think that's where psychotherapy is political.
Yeah.
We live in a structure which is particularly in a democracy where look at what the fight is about the vote. People are trying to keep people from having a voice, from having a vote.
Mm-hmm.
So we live in a structure that depends on everybody having a voice.
Mm-hmm.
But you can just see that's what the fight is about. We don't want everyone to have a voice.
Right.
And I think that the therapists have not really engaged with, it's not that should therapists be political? I mean, in the usual sense of that question, no. I mean, it's not up to a therapist to decide what people should do or how they should live. Are therapists engaged in something that has political implications? Absolutely. Because democratic, whether it's relationships, families, societies, states, depend on everyone having a voice.
Yeah.
And that's the heart of psychotherapy, as far as I can see.
Carol,
And
talking
education. I mean, you know.
Yep. I was just going I didn't mean to silence you there, but we have just a couple minutes left, and I feel like I've made you talk for almost a full hour now. So I just want to ask before we go if you have any recommendations for therapists or psychologists or who are interested in finding a way to sort of use their own voice or promote the use of the voices of their clients or the people in their community. Any good resources, books, people to follow? Anyone you're recommending right now?
Oh, I think we know a tremendous amount. Yes, I mean, I really do. I'd say to every therapist, first of all, start by, you should watch Ed Tronick's, see what is it, 2 minute still face experiment, and realize that at 1 year of age, we know the difference between who's in relationship with us and who isn't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that we can spot the difference. Then the developmental work says that these times of initiation are times where people's resilience is at heightened risk. And so, you know, I did something that I would in addition to saying therapists, listen for the words actually, really, the phrase to be honest. If you see a man who seems to be emotionally clueless, ask, where is the 4-year-old emotionally intelligent boy? That man once was an emotionally intelligent 4-year-old boy. What happened to that boy? Listen for the, and if you see a woman who appears to have no voice, ask, where's the 11-year-old girl who says what she really thinks and feels?
Great.
And what does it take to invite her into your presence? And one of the things that it takes is that she has to be convinced that if she speaks, if she brings that voice into your presence, you will listen to it. And you will take it seriously and you will respond. And you, because the reason that voice gets covered is because it was too risky to have it out in the open.
Yeah. So
pay attention, listen for the pre-initiated voice. I like to call it the wild voice. That's a phrase from the poet Louise Gluck. Listen for the wild voice. Listen for the voice of the 4 or 5-year-old boy. Listen for the voice of the 9, 10, 11-year-old girl. And question the cover voice. So I'm going to give you my all-time favorite example, which comes from a couple. Terry Real and I saw couples together when they were at an impasse in their relationships. And I'll never forget, there was this man, he and his wife were leaders in their church. And they were leaders for women's rights and everything else. And they were very successful in their business or whatever they did. And they had reached an impasse in the marriage because the man suspected that his wife was having an affair with one of her colleagues at work. And he would ask her, are you sleeping with a guy? And she wouldn't answer the question. Now, you could say the fact that she wouldn't answer is an answer, but it was a kind of, he wanted her to answer. I mean, because I remember saying, if I know it's 3:00, I don't ask Terry, what time is it? I mean, sort of, but nevertheless. So he turns to me and Terry, and he says, it's the ultimate nightmare, her in the arms of another man. Now, I know about the Trojan War. I know this culture. I know until recently there were minimal consequences. If a man found his wife with another man, he could kill them both with very minimal. But I also could think of worse nightmares. I actually could think of worse things. So it was a real question when I said to him, why is that the ultimate nightmare? And he said to me, the ultimate nightmare really for me, there's the word, is never being able to show her how I really feel. That's the word. To be a family man and to open my heart and to love her. And I thought, that is underneath the ultimate nightmare is her in the arms of another man. But if I hadn't questioned that, if I hadn't said, why is that the ultimate nightmare? And it was a real question for me. Like the girl, when she said, I don't like myself enough to look out for myself, I wondered, did she really feel that way? I mean, it has to be a real question. If you question the covered voice, you'll hear the under voice. And then you have to say the voice isn't covered for no reason. So what happens if you bring it out? Because if he left that therapy office, and I mean, it's one kind of response he'll get from other men and businessmen like him if he says, you know, I think my wife is having an affair with her colleague. As if he said, you know, the ultimate nightmare for me is I can't show her how I really feel. I mean, he understood what was going on in that marriage. Mm-hmm. So I really think we have a lot of information now that this initiation starts with young boys around the ages of 4 and 5. It then picks up with girls when they reach puberty, when they start to become young women. It replays with boys in adolescence. And then we have basically everyone kind of living in a state of dissociation from their humanity. And then we can't solve these very pressing human problems that we face as a society right now.
Right. Carol, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to talk.
Valuable information. It's such a tricky time. Really appreciate it.
But I really think we have a lot of information. And I think this sort of, I think really at this particular moment in history where it feels very urgent to me that therapists really kind of engage with these issues.
Yeah.
And, in a sense, psychotherapy, it has the power to undo dissociation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And therefore, it's basically a very radical practice. And I think that it's time to kind of step up to that and think about really what we're doing and what we know.
Yeah.
And not act as if we don't know what we know.
Yep. Perfect. Carol, thank you so much.
Well, Lauren, thank you. This was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for chiming in and being with us today. Take care, everyone.
You too.